In today's tutorial, we're going to learn how to animate in Clip Studio Paint. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have your very own animated GIF that you can share. So let's get started. So to make a new animation, we want to make a new project by going to File, New, and there's this animation template here where you can set up an animation, and there's the default template of 1920 by 1080. You also get some margins on the outside, so you can doodle on the outside. Kind of useful. You can also set up your frame rate and everything over here, but I want to show you how to set up one just from scratch. So we're going to make a new illustration, set it to 1920 by 1080 pixels, and press OK. And we're going to need two windows. One of them should be open already, your layers window over here, and we need our timeline window. So go up to Window, make sure Layer is turned on, as well as Timeline right here. Now to create an animation, we need to make a new timeline. So if we go down here, we can see Edit Timeline and New Timeline button. So we want to click New Timeline, and that'll bring up our options on how long our animation's going to be and what the frame rate is. Don't worry about this, you can always change any of this stuff later if you so choose. But for our example, we're going to do a frame rate of 12 frames per second, and we're going to do a playback time of 24. So at 12 frames per second and then 24 frames long, that's going to give us 2 seconds of animation. If you're using the EX version of Clip Studio Paint, which is the cheaper version, you're limited to 24 frames. But if you're doing simple loops and stuff like that, that should be plenty. If you want an unlimited number of frames to work with, you need to upgrade to the Pro version. And I would wait for it to be on sale, honestly. Clip Studio Paint goes on sale all the time. The rest of these three we don't really need to worry about. They're just there for organizational purposes. And then press OK, and you can see new stuff has shown up in our timeline down here. But we actually can't animate yet. We need to make what's called an animation folder. So an animation folder is a folder inside of your Clip Studio layers that contains all of your animation cells, that contains all of your layers. We're going to go up to here, up to this button that says New Animation Folder. We'll click that, and it makes a new folder in our timeline, and we can also see a new folder right here in our layers. So in my timeline, I can click and drag this red bar for my playhead. This scrubs through my animation. I can also change how long my animation is or how short the playback is. I can make my animation playback start sooner or end sooner by dragging these. And if I want to change any settings on my animation, I can click these 3 lines on the top left on my timeline window, and here's where all your timeline options are. To change things like frame rate and how long your animation is, that's going to be under timeline, and then you can change frame rate here, or you can change settings here. So here's another way you can make your animation shorter or longer. To start animating, we have to create a new animation cell. You can see right now I have my animation folder selected. I'm on frame 1, but I actually can't draw anything because I don't have an animation cell created. So we're going to click this New Animation Cell button right here. That'll make a blank frame number 1, and you can see it's added a new layer underneath our group right here, our animation folder. For this example, let's just start with a simple circle. And we have our first animation frame. Let's drag our playhead to frame number 2. Make sure we have our animation folder selected. You can see if I select onto a different layer, I no longer have the option to create a new animation cell because I don't have my animation folder selected. So make sure you have your animation folder selected. We're on frame 2, and we're going to click New Animation Cell. That will get rid of our artwork up here, and we can see that frame number 2 has been added right here, and also a new drawing layer has been added inside of our animation folder. To be able to see what our previous frame was, we want to turn on onion skin, and that's with this button right here, Enable Onion Skin. So if we turn that on, we can see a ghost image of the drawing that came before it. So let's get this circle moving. So I'm just going to draw it kind of close to where we started, but just have it start to move a little bit in this direction. And you can see down here, I have my thumbnails enabled so that I can see what my drawings look like. If you want to change your thumbnail size, you can click under this 3-line setting button on the top left, go to thumbnail size, and you can change the size of your thumbnails right here. So let's go to frame 3, make sure we have our animation folder selected, press this New Animation Cell button, And you can always set these to be hotkeys, which is usually a good idea for animation as it'll speed up your workflow. I highly recommend having hotkeys set up. To edit hotkeys, you can go under File, and shortcut settings. And if you select menu commands up here, all of your animation shortcut keys are going to be under this animation section here. So things like new animation cell, which in my setup I have set to F6, could be pretty useful. Also, go to previous frame and go to next frame is useful to have shortcuts set up for. The typical setup is using comma for previous frame and period for next frame. So those are some ideas of shortcut keys that could be useful to have set up. And for my onion skin, currently I can only see one previous drawing. If I want to see more than one previous drawing, I can click our settings button on our timeline again, and onion skin settings are going to be under show animation cells, and then onion skin settings right here. And I can change this to show 3 previous frames and 3 next frames. Here you can also change if you want it to be colored onion skins, half colored, or keep it as the original color. So if I keep it as the original color and press OK, you can see it's turned black. I personally like having colored onion skins just because it allows me to see what the previous drawing was and what the next drawing is. So now we can see our 2 previous drawings. So let's draw drawing number 3 down here. And if we want to play our animation, we can click this play button here. But let's say this feels a little bit fast, this movement from here to here. So we want to do an in-between. So to do an in-between between these 2 drawings, we can select our frame by clicking on it once. You'll see a red bar behind the frame to show that that frame is selected. So frame number 3 here is selected. I can select it and then click and drag it over by 1, or however many you want. We'll just drag it over by 1. And you'll see that makes frame number 2 last for 2 frames and then goes on to frame 3. So now what we can do, we can go in between frames 2 and 3, click add new animation cell in between the 2, hence the name in between, and then draw our in between those 2 drawings. And that's a way to smooth out your motion. If something's popping way too fast, you can add an in between that way. If you want to select multiple frames, you can click and drag a box around just like that, and that'll select multiple frames, and then you can click and move multiple frames that way. If you want to copy and paste frames, you don't want to do Control-C and Control-V, because what that does is actually copies and pastes a layer over here, which is not what we're trying to do. We want to copy and paste these frames. So to do that, we actually want to right-click, go to Copy, and then go to where we want those frames to be, right-click, and select Paste. So we copy and paste frames in the right-click menu on our timeline. To get rid of a frame, let's say we have a frame of animation that doesn't belong anymore, we can select it and hit this Delete Specified Cells button right here, and that removes it from the timeline. But it actually doesn't delete the drawing still exists, and we can see it over here in our animation folder right here. It's just been unassigned onto our timeline here. So the way the timeline works is it assigns a specific layer onto that part in our animation. So like I said, our frame that we got rid of, it still exists. It's still over here. And if we want to bring it back, we have to do what's called Specify Frame. And that's this button right here called Specify Cells. And if we click that, we can see a list of all of our drawings here. So drawing number 4 was the one we just got rid of. So if we select that and press OK, we now have our drawing number 4 back. An easier way to do that is to just right click in that frame and then select it from the right click menu here. Likewise, I can also go into my layers panel here, create a new layer. And then if I want that new layer to be assigned in my animation, I can right click in here, select frame 5, and that's assigned that layer into here. So let's say for this example, I have my animation frame number 5 right here. And then outside of my animation folder, I have this drawing right here. So you can see this is a separate drawing from my animation frame right here. So let's say we wanted to copy and paste these together. How would we do that? Well, it's not super intuitive actually. And this is something that I struggled with for a long time, figuring out how do I just copy this face and then paste it into frame 5 here. You can see I pressed Control-V, but nothing happened. It made it as a new animation cell. So you can actually see I can right click, select frame 6, and there's the drawing I just pasted. If you want to paste something in and have it merge into the layer below, you actually have to shift select the 2 drawings that you copied and pasted, move it outside the animation folder window, and then you can right click and say merge with layer below. And now if we turn our eyeball on and off, we can see those are now merged, and we drag it back into the animation folder. And then we simply right click and re-specify that frame. And now we have our animation with our copied and pasted artwork into it. Another cool thing we can do is, even though each one of our animation cells is a layer, we can actually convert this into a group. So if we take frame 5 here, right click on it, and select Create Folder and Insert Layer, you'll see it creates a folder that's named number 5 as well. And inside of this folder, you can actually have multiple layers. So you could draw a smiley face in here. You could even do a layer and put it underneath, have your color. So you can even use folders in your animation as single animation cells. Another useful thing to know, if you have a lot of frames and they're all out of order and mismatched as far as names go, you can always go up to Animation, Edit Track, and then select Rename in Timeline Order. And that will rename all of your frames according to their order on the animation timeline. So just for fun, let's continue animating this ball just moving around. We're going to keep going one frame over and draw our ball moving around. Experiment with smear frames. Experiment with seeing how far you can move the ball. So this is called spacing, how far apart your drawings are spaced. So if your drawings are spaced really far apart, they're going to appear to move quickly. And then at the end here, if our drawings are drawn more close together, that's going to make them appear to move slower. So just experiment, play around, and have fun with it. After all, this is supposed to be fun. So now if we play it, we can see what our animation looks like. And if we want it to loop, we can select this loop play button right here, and we can see how it turned out. Pretty neat. If we want to export our animation, we can go up to File, Export Animation, and you can either export it as a movie file or an animated GIF are probably the most common ways you're going to export. Let's select Animated GIF. And then if we save it, it'll bring up some options on how you want it to save. Now, make sure that your file size is the correct size according to what your original animation was. In this case, it's 1920 by 1080. And for the loop count, we want it to loop over and over again, so we're going to select Unlimited. Dithering is mostly important if you have like gradients or soft shading. You'd want to have dithering turned on, and then press OK. And then we get a little message pop up saying how big our animation turned out to be. Press OK, and then we can double click on it to open it. Very cool. So now you can post this GIF in forums, send it to your grandma, whatever you want to do with it. So one thing when animating is you want to make sure that your character stays consistent and that they don't change volume or go off model or anything like that. I just did this ball animation just straight ahead, and you can see that I definitely lost volume. It got a lot smaller. So how do you correct that? How do you fix that? Well, Clip Studio has a tool that's very useful for stuff like that. You can imagine it like taking your first frame as a piece of paper and then being able to place it underneath this frame and move it around. So you can reference your first frame no matter what frame of animation you're drawing on. And that's called the light table. In order to see the light table, we need a new window. So we want to go up to Window, and then select Animation Cells. And I have mine docked over here. It might be down here somewhere. I like having it docked over here just so I can more clearly see what's going on. And there might be this bar that's like way down here and like really hard to see. You want to make sure to take this bar and drag it up around the middle. So make sure that's there. One last thing of setup is on these 3 buttons down here that say Enable Disable Light Tool, you want to select this third one right here. And then to be able to use it, you want to select Enable Light Table up here. So make sure only the third one is turned on here and Enable Light Table is turned on over here as well. So the way this works is super easy. Just go to whatever frame you want to reference. In this case, it's frame number 1. You'll see that frame appear over here. So we want to take frame number 1 and click and drag it into this bottom section down here. That will enable frame 1 to be on our light table. So now you can see when we drag through our timeline, frame 1 sticks around, and we can go to any frame we want and we can use this frame as reference. It's in the wrong position. We need to move it over here. So how do we do that? Well, it's really easy. All you have to do is go into your light table window here and select frame 1 from this bottom section here. And that will automatically switch you to the tool you need to move it around. So you can see our transformation tools appear here. We can rotate it using this handle. We can change where it rotates with this cross right here. We can scale it by dragging the corners. We can also flip it horizontal by selecting this flip horizontal button up here, or flip it vertical using the button next to it. And if you want to reset your transformation, you click this Reset Transformation button here, and that will set it back to its default position. So for this example, we want to move it underneath our layer here, and to get back onto our original frame, we want to select the top layer, in this case, layer number 14 under our light table tool here. And now we can go back in and redraw our frame so it's the correct size. Also on the light table, you can change its color by selecting this top right button here and selecting monochrome, and that'll change it to this blue color. You can change it by clicking this drop down and then selecting change layer color and turn it into any color you want. You can keep this light table on and just turn it on and off using this enable light tool button here. Or if you want to get rid of a frame from your light table, you can select this trash can here to get rid of it. And that's how to use the light table to keep your animation consistent. Next, let's talk about Motion-Tweens. So I'm going to make a new animation. I'm going to click the eyeball to hide the one we just created, and I'm going to click New Animation Folder to make a new animation, click New Animation Cell to do a new drawing, and I'll just draw my first frame. So to motion tween this layer, we want to click on this button, enable keyframes on this layer. And when we click it, it turns on, and now we can click this plus on our animation, and then click this arrow to drop down to show all the things that we can animate. So you can animate position, rotation, scale. You can also animate opacity down here. You can right click and go to add keyframe, and then let's drag our playhead to the last frame. And in order to move this and change it, we actually don't want to use the move layer tool, and we don't want to press Ctrl T to transform it. That's not going to work. We actually want to use this tool in Clip Studio, which is under Operation, and then click Object. And then when we click on our layer, we'll see our transform tools appear. So now we can take our animation, and if we hold Shift while we move it, it'll stay in a straight line, and you'll see that'll automatically create keyframes in between. And if we drag our playhead, we now have a motion tween. If we play it, you'll see he starts out slow, speeds up, and then slows down again. So this is called smooth interpolation. In order to change it so it's not smooth at the beginning and at the end, we can select this drop down here, and instead of smooth interpolation, we can select linear interpolation. Hold interpolation is kind of like stop motion where it pops from one keyframe to the other. So we'll select linear interpolation, and to change any of our keyframes, we just click this button here, and you'll see they'll turn green, showing that they're linear keyframes. We can also change it to be linear at the end here. And now if we play it, you'll see there's no easing at the beginning and the end. So that's how to motion tween an animation. You'll see in this example, I drew a walking guy, but he's not actually walking. He just stays on the same frame throughout the whole entire animation. If you wanted to animate frame by frame underneath this motion tween, what we have to do is we have to turn off keyframe mode by clicking this button here. And that enables us to go back into frame by frame animation mode, where we can do a new animation cell, turn on our onion skin, draw our second frame, and then we could just animate frame by frame this way. So now we have our frame by frame animation. If we have our animation selected and we enable keyframes again, we can now play it with our frame by frame animation happening on our motion tween. Also with these keyframes, you can right click on them and switch their interpolation from the right click menu as well. You can also copy and paste them by right clicking, going copy, and then right clicking and going paste. And you can drag them around simply by dragging and moving them. And if you want to get rid of one, you can click this delete keyframe button right here, and that'll get rid of it. So now that we know how to motion tween, we can animate a camera. To add a camera to your scene, we want to go up to Animation, New Animation Layer, and select 2D Camera Folder. And when we do that, we can see it added a camera on our timeline layer, as well as a camera folder right here. So the way the camera works in Clip Studio Paint is anything you want to be affected by this camera has to be inside of this camera folder. So chances are you want to shift select your entire animation and just click and drag it into the camera folder like so. And now when we animate the camera, it should affect our entire animation. So under our timeline, select the first frame on our camera folder right here, and then press this add keyframe button. Again, if you want to change the interpolation, whether you want it to be linear or smooth, you can just select the keyframe, right click, and say switch to linear, smooth, or hold interpolation. For cameras, chances are you want it to be a smooth interpolation, which is this purple keyframe here. Then let's go to frame number 24, or actually let's have it zoom in on frame 13, and then track and follow the character out to the last frame. So on frame 13, we want to add a keyframe by clicking this add keyframe button here, and then go to our object tool, which is under Operation and then Object. And the way the camera works is this blue frame is what the camera is going to be seeing. So if you want to do a zoom in, you want to actually shrink this blue rectangle into how much you want it to be zoomed in. And if you click and drag this corner here, you'll see it's scaling onto the corner, which might not necessarily be what you want. You probably want it to scale into the center here. So the way to do that is you want to click the corner, click and hold, and then hold down your Alt button, and that will scale it towards the center. And now you can see these camera movement indicators here on the corner here. So let's go into our last frame here, press Insert Keyframe button, and we'll just click and move this blue rectangle to follow our character. Again, we can hold Shift so it stays along the same axis, right about there. And now when we play it, well, we can see our camera moving, but it's kind of hard to tell what's going on. If you want to actually see what your animation's going to look like, you have to go under Animation, Playback Settings, and then Render 2D Camera. So if we select that and then play it, now we can see what our camera looks like. So that's how to animate a camera in Clip Studio Paint. The last thing I want to talk about is lip sync in Clip Studio Paint. Now, Clip Studio Paint is technically not an animation program. One of the downsides about Clip Studio Paint is you can't scrub audio, which if you know anything about lip sync, scrubbing audio is super important. It's how you understand where the syllables are and everything. So it's not the best, but I'll show you how to do it anyway. To import audio into your animation, you can literally drag it from a folder into your animation. Or another way to do it is to go to File, Import, and select Audio. Then select the audio you want to import. I recommend using .wav files. They seem to give the best reliability and performance as opposed to .mp3 files. So select your .wav file. If you want to record your own audio, I recommend using the free program Audacity and a microphone. You could also download audio from Let's Plays or movies that you really like to experiment with. So it's added our WAV file to the top of our timeline here. And if we go to the top of the layer, you'll see our cursor turns into a hand. So we can actually click and drag and move this audio around just like that. So if we want it to start later, we can do that there. And again, there's no audio scrubbing. So scrubbing it over the audio actually doesn't do anything. I can't hear anything doing it this way. So what I have to do is I have to play it. Golly! And kind of just see where my playhead is at the different syllables. So when doing lip sync animation, I actually recommend animating the body first. In this section, I'm going to talk about how to animate a lip sync shot from beginning to end, including body acting. If you want to get to the part where I just talk about how to lip sync in Clip Studio Paint, skip to this time code right here. Probably the most important thing in character animation is your body language. Your body should communicate what the line is saying before expressions, before your eyes, before lip sync, before any of that stuff is applied. And a way we can do that is animating our rough animation first. I like animating with really simple shapes before I animate more complex shapes. It's just easier to squash and stretch really simple shapes rather than fully rendered, cleaned up drawings. So this is usually how I start my first stage of animation. And things like hair or his hat in this example, I will animate last because they tend to be animated separately. This is called overlapping action. It's stuff that kind of trails behind and then has a little bit of settle after the main volumes of the body have moved. So things like hair, boobs, fat on a character are all really good examples of that. So he squashes down to prepare for his line, and maybe he jumps up for golly. And again, I'll use my light table just to make sure I'm keeping things consistent. And we want them to end up back on frame number 1. So I'm going to right click, copy that frame, right click, paste it around there. So that's where we want to end up. Golly! Okay, so that feels pretty good for our main body. Next, I'll do a new animation folder on top. First of all, let's name these. So this is rough body layer, and this will be rough overlap for overlapping action. So for overlapping action, I usually like to have the root follow the body and then leave the tail of anything about 1 or 2 frames behind. So that's kind of what I'm keeping in mind as I'm going through and doing these. So the root follows the body, then the tail gets left behind, and I kind of just animate it straight ahead. And then anytime the character stops is when I'll start to have overlapping actions start to catch up. So even though the body is holding for a frame, I'll have his hat and his hair start to settle. And then here's a really big move, so things get really left behind while the root follows the body, just like that. And then again, his body's holding up here, so we'll start to have his hair catch up, as well as his hat will start to go up and then start to trail behind as he's falling down. So this is why I animate overlapping action last, because you really want your body mechanics and your body acting figured out before you start doing this stuff, because you kind of start from frame 1 and then work your way through the animation, sort of one frame at a time from beginning to end. You follow what the body is doing. So here's where he's landing, so his hair and everything really gets left behind. And then here we can have gravity start to affect it, so things drop down. And here I'll delay the settle just by one frame. So this is our last frame. And actually, on our original animation, let's get rid of the hair on here since we're doing it on a separate layer, just like that. Okay, and then we'll just start in-betweening until they settle into the final animation frame.
Golly!
And that looks pretty good. I think we could probably call that good.
Golly!
So there's our rough body acting. So now what we could do is we could take these animation folders, right-click, and then say Create Folder and Insert Layer, and just call this whole folder rough animation. And then we can take that folder and actually lower that folder's opacity. And you could do that not just with regular folders, you could also do that with animation folders. Like I could also take these animation folders and set them to low opacity. You can also click this button here to turn folders into a blue sketch layer and then lower the opacity, which is really nice for doing rough animation. And then we'll do a new animation folder on top and we'll call this cleanup. So this is just a suggested workflow. It's something that may work for you if you're learning how to animate in Clip Studio Paint. So I'm going to go through and clean up all of my keyframes first, since those are my main poses. And now that I have all my keyframes cleaned up, I can go ahead and start doing my in-betweens. Okay, now we have our cleanup all done.
Golly!
We can start animating his mouth. So let's make a new animation folder, and we'll just draw his first mouth right here. Now for lip sync, I'm going to turn off our other animation layers and we'll just focus on just the mouth for now. For lip sync, I suggest checking yourself out in the mirror and saying the line, in this case, golly. It's really just a slightly open mouth, and then like an A-shaped mouth, and then tongue touching the top of the teeth, then sort of an E-shaped mouth, and then back to default. So this is like the G, and then A, and then L, and then E. So those are the kind of mouth shapes I think I'm going to go for. So let's try and time these out. So like I said earlier, there's no way to actually scrub this audio to see how it's playing. You could do it in a different program and map your lip sync that way. But in Clip Studio, what generally I see people do is literally just play the audio.
Golly!
And kind of judge where the mouth shapes are going to change. So I'm going to do a blank frame. Turn on our onion skin. There's a million different ways to do what I'm doing here, but my plan here is to animate the mouth just on one layer in the same place, and then we'll use Motion-Tweens to move it into place on our animation here. Another way to do it is to animate it on the character, and that's completely fine too. That's a great way to do it. And you can also kind of see the waveform right here to kind of see where different pieces of audio are going to happen. So for golly, it's probably going to be about here where the waveform like peaks. So let's do there. So this was the ah shape for golly, and then L for Lee. So if we drag to where the audio is and press play from that spot, we can kind of hear that there's an L shape happening there. Again, not the most efficient way to lip sync, but it works. So there's our L shape, and then E happens about here. And for the final frame, I generally like to have the mouth close about 3 to 5 frames after the audio is done. Now that's on 24 frames per second. Remember, we're on 12, so about half of that would be like 2 frames after the audio's done, 2 to 3 frames. So if we play what we have so far,
golly!
That's not bad.
Golly!
One thing I would recommend doing for lip sync is after you get it pretty well timed out, select all of your mouth shapes and move them 1 frame behind if you're on 12 frames per second, or if you're on 24 frames per second, move it 2 frames behind. Because light travels faster than sound is typically how I've heard it explained, but it just makes lip sync match just a little bit better.
Golly!
And I think that looks pretty good. And that's one of the reasons I like to animate on a separate layer and then have it motion-tweened into place, just because I like doing that last minute adjustment of moving the frames 2 frames behind.
Golly!
And now that we have our lip sync all done, we can enable keyframes on this layer And since we don't want it to motion tween, we want it to just pop from one pose to the other, we're going to change our keyframe interpolation to hold, and then we'll click this button to add a keyframe on frame 1. Go to our operation tool and select object so we can move it around. And just go frame by frame and just move the mouth where it needs to be. And when you move it, you'll see it creates keyframes for you. And on your animation, it might need some adjusting, you know, especially if the mouth doesn't fit on the face, or, you know, if you need to change how big the mouth is on any single frame, you can always go back and readjust things if you need to. This is just going to be a really quick example. And let's copy this frame, paste it right here where it resets to default. And now if we play our lip synced animation,
Golly!
it works pretty well.
Golly!
So that's how you animate body mechanics and then add lip sync on top of it. One final thing I want to go over before we end this tutorial is how to color your animation. Clip Studio actually has some really cool tools for coloring, and I'll show you those now. For coloring animation, I'm going to create a new animation folder underneath my cleanup folder here. So new animation folder, double click on the folder name to rename it. We'll call it color. And then make a new blank animation frame here. Now, you could take a brush and just manually color it in like so, but that's a little tedious, difficult. A really cool way to do this in Clip Studio is to actually go to your layers panel here, select your line art layer, which in this case is called cleanup, and click this little lighthouse button up here. It's called a reference layer. So the way a reference layer works is if you use a tool like the paint bucket tool, it's going to consider any layer that has a reference turned on, and we'll actually use it to fill it in, even though we're not filling in on that layer itself. So that's super neat. Under your tool options, it should be enabled by default, but with your paint bucket selected, you'll want to have this little lighthouse turned on. And you can click once to fill in each section, or what I like to do is click and drag to have it fill in multiples. So we could really quickly just go frame by frame, create blank animation cells, and just really quickly fill in colors this way. You'll see I have a propensity for liking broken lines, so it doesn't always work. What you could do in those cases is just take your brush here and just close those gaps, and then use the fill in tool just like that. And it's just a really quick way to fill in color on your animation. Super neat.
Golly!
And that's it. Hopefully this was helpful to you and got you started with animating in Clip Studio Paint. Be sure to click here to subscribe to my channel to stay updated on future videos and tutorials. If you'd like to help support my work, you can click here to visit my Patreon page. You also get access to rewards like early access to tutorials, source animation files, and access to a secret Patreon-only chat room. Keep on animating, and until next time, bye-bye!